President Donald Trump's administration has significantly stepped up pressure on Venezuela, deploying a robust U.S. naval and expeditionary force in the southern Caribbean as part of a broader campaign against narcotics and non-state armed groups. At the same time, the government of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro has warned of catastrophic consequences, mobilizing both conventional forces and civilian militias and signaling that the country's extensive weapons arsenal could buy it time against a large-scale U.S. force. In recent months, the U.S. has shifted from a law enforcement-style approach to drug trafficking in Latin America, typically handled by the Coast Guard or regional police cooperation, toward a military hard power posture. On 2 September 2025, President Trump publicly announced that U.S. forces had conducted a precision strike on a boat departing Venezuela, alleging it carried narcotics and was operated by a designated narco-terrorist organization. He told reporters, "We just, over the last few minutes, literally shot out a boat, a drug-carrying boat, a lot of drugs in that boat," he added, "and there's more where that came from." We have a lot of drugs pouring into our country, coming in for a long time. These came out of Venezuela. That strike marked the first publicly acknowledged U.S. Evan Dyer military operation in the region against a target linked to Venezuela in decades. The U.S. has since built up a deployment of multiple warships, a nuclear-powered submarine, thousands of sailors and Marines, surveillance aircraft, and special operations forces in the southern Caribbean and Puerto Rico, hovering near Venezuelan waters. The administration has also legally redefined its target. By early October, the U.S. Officially notified Congress that it was engaged in a non-international armed conflict with drug trafficking organizations in the Caribbean, and that those organizations could be treated as unlawful combatants. How these definitions will translate in practice remains contested. President Nicolás Maduro responded by declaring that his country had entered a state of maximum preparedness in the face of what he described as an extravagant, unjustifiable, immoral and absolutely criminal and bloody threat. He warned that any attack by U.S. forces would trigger mobilization of civilian militia members and full readiness of the Venezuelan armed forces. He said, "In the face of this maximum military pressure, we have declared maximum preparedness for the defense of Venezuela." His government lodged protests with the United Nations, declaring the U.S. strikes in international waters to be extrajudicial executions and a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. Independent UN experts backed that view, saying lethal action in international waters without proper legal basis runs contrary to international law. One central issue in the dynamic is Venezuela's weapons holdings and what time that arsenal could buy for Caracas in the event of a wider confrontation. Venezuela has, over many years, acquired an array of advanced armaments, including Russian-supplied anti-air missile systems, fighter aircraft, and coastal defense units, although many analysts say the country's military is underfunded, poorly maintained, and much weaker than its rhetoric suggests. President Maduro has made various public claims about Venezuela's defensive capability. He asserted that the country has deployed surface-to-air systems even in the last mountain, the last town, and the last city of the territory. His government argues that any aggressive U.S. move would face a far tougher response than Washington anticipates. For the U.S., the risk is that if any operation expanded beyond maritime interdiction into Venezuelan territory, for example, landings or strikes on military installations, Venezuela's defenses and mobilization could impose higher cost, time, and risk than a simple shock and awe campaign. In your transcript, mention was made of a scenario in which U.S. forces numbering around 10,000 might be deployed for an operation against Venezuela. That figure aligns with some reporting. Estimates suggest roughly 10,000 U.S. personnel are currently in the region linked to the Caribbean deployment and preparations for possible operations. Whether those forces would be used for a large invasion remains speculative. From Venezuela's perspective, any U.S. land or amphibious operation would face logistical challenges, sustained resistance, and time constraints. The Venezuelan government and state-controlled media have emphasized that their weapons stockpiles and militia mobilization would buy them time to resist or impose higher casualty risk on a potential U.S. force. The logic is not that Venezuela anticipates defeating the United States militarily. Rather, the argument is that a well-armed defender can raise the cost, delay operations, disrupt timelines, and force the attacker to face domestic, political, regional, diplomatic, and logistical burdens. Weapons systems such as anti-aircraft missiles, coastal defense batteries, mobile rocket launchers, and well-motivated militia can transform what might have been a rapid raid into a prolonged campaign. In this context, Venezuela's arsenal becomes not so much about winning outright, but about creating drag, delaying U.S. operational timelines, complicating decision-making in Washington, generating diplomatic backlash in the region, and possibly providing time for Caracas to negotiate or seek external support. For the United States, the publicly stated goal remains suppression of drug trafficking, putting pressure on the Venezuelan leadership's alleged connections to major trafficking networks, disrupting logistics in the Caribbean sea route, and cutting the flow of cocaine and other illicit substances into the U.S. market. Analysts note, however, that the hardware being deployed, destroyers, submarine special ops, may exceed the requirements of standard drug interdiction operations. Some experts believe the broader aim includes regime change or, at minimum, coercive diplomacy to bring Venezuela's strategic resources under U.S. influence. The U.S. administration acknowledges the legal and strategic risks of any wider campaign, including the possibility of failure, unintended escalation, and regional backlash. President Trump has reportedly expressed reservations about a full regime change operation, citing concerns over the ability to succeed. The scenario outlined in your transcript that Venezuela's weapons could buy time against a U.S. force of 10,000 aligns with current open source analysis. While Venezuela would likely not win a conventional war against the United States, its remaining defensive infrastructure, militia capacity, and terrain advantage could complicate and delay U.S. operations. This aligns with Caracas's own messaging and analysts' assessments of the campaign plan. Additionally, recent UN commentary, naval deployments, and public strikes suggest the U.S. has moved beyond mere signaling and into kinetic operations, albeit so far primarily at sea and in international waters, rather than large-scale land operations inside Venezuela. If the U.S. seeks to operate on Venezuelan territory, it risks violating sovereignty norms, drawing Latin American countries into diplomatic opposition, and provoking a broader regional security crisis. For Venezuela, the mobilization of militias and heavy armaments, alongside the claim of being under threat, may serve domestic purposes, rallying the populace, boosting regime legitimacy, even if the actual capability is limited. For Washington, the risk is domestic politics. Any military failure, high casualty count, or lack of clear exit strategy could reflect badly. At the same time, cutting off Venezuelan oil and mineral flows or undermining the regime's finances via drug suppression has clear strategic appeal. The time-buying logic suggests that even if Venezuela cannot stop U.S. forces outright, its aim may be to force a stalemate negotiation or at least sufficient delay to shape the outcome on more favorable terms. And there's more where that came from. We have a lot of drugs pouring into our country, coming in for a long time. These came out of Venezuela. President Maduro, in the face of this maximum military pressure, we have declared maximum preparedness for the defense of Venezuela. The current dynamic between the United States and Venezuela features a substantial U.S. players, military buildup in the Caribbean, and a Venezuelan regime positioning itself to resist or delay any potential incursion by highlighting its arsenal and mobilization. While the United States retains overwhelming military superiority, Venezuela's strategy appears aimed at buying time, raising cost, and complicating any U.S. timetable. The possibility of a 10,000-strong U.S. force operating in the region is real. However, the outcome will depend less on raw numbers and more on how quickly the U.S. can achieve its strategic goals and how effectively Venezuela can slow, raise price and force a negotiated outcome.